And then when you won't do Q&A, you want me to run the second one? Well, you don't have a lot.
That may be helpful,
Yeah, it's helpful. Just you do the side that Bill, excuse me, that Bill Smith is on, so I don't have to deal with him right away. I'll probably use this. Oh, this has plenty of battery.
Yeah.
Plenty.
All right. Let's, off we go.
Ready?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm ready to rock and roll. Wonderful.
Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? That's good. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And of course, the theme of the week is artificial intelligence. And for today, we're fortunate that Dr. Stefan Fritsch is able to be with us. Stefan is an associate professor of international relations in the political science department at Bowling Green State University, where he is also affiliated with the International Studies program. He received his master's and PhD from the University of Salzburg, Austria. And today's session is the geopolitics of artificial intelligence. The emerging AI technology has triggered a new global scramble between countries and companies to master AI and either stay at the cutting edge of innovation or try to catch up to the leaders in the field, intensifying geopolitical struggles between the major world powers such as the United States, China, India, or the European Union, furthering to fuel the competition for global AI superiority. And as always, I ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Dr. Stefan Fritsch.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. Hello back to Ohio. I'm currently in Florence, Italy, doing some research here over the summer on the European Union's approach to artificial intelligence. That means the regulation. And so I'm very happy to, so to speak, zoom back to my, my home state of Ohio. Also, thank you for your willingness to listen to such a rather heavy topic early in the morning. I hope you all had a good breakfast. And let's see. Okay, so just a brief outline on what I intend to do here in the time allotted. So I'm going to briefly provide you with a definition of AI, at least the definition I work with, particularly for this presentation, because there are, as you can imagine, there are a lot of different definitions out there with regard to AI. And we'll touch upon some of these aspects of what is AI actually, because it's similar to other terms that you might be familiar with, such as, for example, globalization. AI has turned into a buzzword, and people associate all kinds of things with that. So I just want to bring in some clarity before we move on. Then I will very briefly just talk about sort of the evolution of AI initially not with the geopolitical context in mind, because that's really a 20th and 21st century issue. But just to counter a little bit these ideas surrounding technological revolutions. Anybody who is a little bit more familiar with the history or the social scientific analysis of technological evolution will quickly sort of come to the realization that we really never can speak of technological revolutions, but sort of a long-term process of accumulation, right? We're accumulating scientific knowledge, we are accumulating technological artifacts and what we call socio-technical systems. And so none of these major turning points in the past that have been deemed revolutions were actually really revolutions, right? It was often a recombination of already existing artifacts or scientific knowledge, right? So I just want to counter that a little bit, and that will help me to demonstrate to you, hopefully, that also AI is not a revolutionary new thing, but it's the result of, at the end of the day, centuries of accumulated technical knowledge. Then I would like to introduce, to make this a little bit more sort of graspable, some comparative data, right? As a political scientist, we love data. And so we're just going to look at some comparative data regarding individual countries' AI, what we call AI capabilities, right? So how ready are countries? And obviously, how do they rank, so to speak, in international comparisons? And then at the end, I would like to sort of address some of the geostrategic developments and also challenges, particularly from a US perspective. Okay, so I'm using a definition from the AI high-level expert group from the European Union from 2019. So that was an expert group that was put together by the European Commission to think about sort of the ways that AI-related challenges might have to be addressed in the future. And so this was a rather large group of experts, and that's what they came up with. So artificial intelligence, and I'm just going to read it out. Artificial intelligence refers to systems that display intelligent behavior by analyzing their environment and taking actions with some degree of autonomy to achieve specific goals. So that sounds pretty abstract. So I thought, let's look at this in a sort of schematic depiction here. So that's really the definition in, I'm very proud of this, by the way, I did this, okay? So this is a piece of art. So you have on the left side the environment, which could be anything, right? I mean, it could be you sitting in front of a TV, you know, and going through Netflix, right? And Netflix, based on your previous viewing history, or you type in a search term, for example, in the Netflix, the user surface, the interface, which would be the sensor, right? The algorithm in Netflix basically takes your search query, your search term, and starts processing this. That's all the stuff that happens in that red circle here on the right side. And we'll basically try and figure out, again, based on the things you previously watched, it probably has figured out your preferences, right? It will look at what's in the database that the algorithm thinks might, you know, suit your preferences, and then it will make suggestions, okay? And those are basically, that's the decision making and the actuators, and you will get recommendations, right? So that's a very abstract, very simple way to think about artificial intelligence. Another example would be autonomous self-driving cars, right? A self-driving car obviously has to perceive the environment it's moving in, the road, you know, other traffic, pedestrians, traffic signs, traffic lights. It works with a ton of sensors, right? To take in all of this information, has to process all of this incoming information, is aware of the laws, so to speak, of what is acceptable behavior, so to speak, for drivers. And based on that, all of this, right, has to make decisions on how to drive the car, right? So that's just another example for AI. Here we have a ton of examples. Many of you maybe have at least one or two of these things in their own homes, right? It could be a Roomba, right? A self and sort of autonomously operating vacuum cleaner. You have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. We on campus have our food delivery robots here at the bottom. You can see them that deliver food all over campus and actually also off campus. Many of you maybe have Alexa at home, or you have probably used ChatGPT, right? To generate some initial draft of a document or a letter or something else. We will soon have self-driving trucks. Well, we already have the self-driving cars, and we have sort of semi-autonomous, what we call semi-autonomous lethal weapon systems. Right here, you would have a Predator drone, right, that operates already semi-autonomously. So there are countless applications. Those are just some more commonly known ones that operate with the help of AI, right, that have significant AI components. All right. Now, is this something new? In the history of technology, no. A lot of the literature that deals with sort of the historical evolution of AI traces this fascination, this human fascination with sort of artificially created thinking machines, artificially self-operating sort of automata back. You can basically go back to Greek mythology, right? The goddess Athena breathes life into a clay figure. I just chose a couple sort of random examples from various time periods. We have autonomously regulating water fountains, right? From a book about sort of mechanical devices from the 12th century, and that came out of the Middle East. We have these rather well-known automata from Central Europe, in this case from southern Germany. Some of you might have seen the famous movie, Fritz Lang's movie Metropolis, right? In which one of the main characters is basically a robot, right? Maria. So we have a long history of this fascination with sort of artificially created life forms, right? Thinking machines, calculating devices, and so on. So if you look at this from this long historical perspective, then AI is just really sort of the latest iteration of this fascination. Okay, so obviously we don't have time to delve into the details of this, although nothing would please me more, but we have to look at the actual origins of what we now generally associate with artificial intelligence. And most literature really sort of points towards World War II, and particularly the efforts to gather military intelligence, and specifically cracking the famous Enigma code, right? You've probably all seen the movie with what is it called? I'm blanking on his name, Cumberbatch, who plays basically Alan Turing, who tries to crack basically on behalf of the British government, right? Tries to crack the Enigma code. With at this point a very crude, mechanical computer that was still using punch cards. So, but most literature says or states that this is, so to speak, the beginning of 20th century AI, right? And it was very crude and minimalistic, and it required tremendously large machines that filled whole houses, right? So from there on, it became a process of trying to constantly refine these mechanical or calculating operations, right? And so it was really sort of the post-World War II era, the 1950s, mid-1950s, where the scientists, computer scientists, engineers sort of started to coin that term, artificial intelligence. It was really coined at the 1956 conference at Dartmouth College, where the term artificial intelligence was used for the first time. And the leading scientists at the time were divided over that terminology because they thought, oh, this sounds too much like sort of, we're trying to imitate human thinking here. And there was also the concern that this might provoke the wrong associations, right? People might be too optimistic. Scientists might overpromise what is possible, which they actually did, but that was mostly in order to gather and to collect, so to speak, R&D funds. However, this was generally a period of great what I call techno-scientific optimism. Pop culture was quite fascinated with futuristic topics, right? Rockets, space travel, robots, computers. And obviously the geopolitical context of the emerging Cold War provided a fertile sort of ground for particularly the US government, right, to start pouring money into this type of research. And it was all about intelligence gathering, already pattern recognition, so to speak, the concern with how can we collect data and how can we, for example, in aerial images, satellite images, aerial images, how can we collect or discern patterns? And the third big topic that early on was already sort of a big thing was language translation. So that's sort of the context here, right? Is definitely the Cold War arms race. Again, without going too much into detail here, this graph shows you, so to speak, the ups and downs of AI research and development. The 1950s and 1960s were generally very optimistic. A lot of funds poured in. There was a lot of things were happening. And then at some point in the late 1960s, it became clear that what was promised couldn't be delivered at that time, right? So we basically ran into technical limitations, right? We didn't have enough computer power to make all these calculations in order to push AI, so to speak, to the next level. And so after each boom, obviously there was a bust. So the 1970s were generally considered an AI winter. That means there wasn't that much development going on. And then it picks up again during the 1980s, followed by a second AI winter in the early 90s. And then sort of it starts picking up, and from then on sort of increases almost constantly, right? So these two winters were driven mostly by limitations with regard to computing power, right? We just didn't have, the computers didn't have the capability to make calculations fast enough, right? And to process more and more calculations actually, right? So AI needs a lot of computing power. Okay, so that's just generally to give you an idea of how this has evolved. Yeah, so in the 50s, 60s, and sort of the first boom period happened in laboratories, right? By the end of the 60s, algorithms could play checkers and tic-tac-toe pretty well. The first robots could sort of construct tiny little things, like let's say you give them 10 wooden blocks and they could differentiate between the round ones and the square ones, right? That was possible, but not much more. And so the reason is that once you take these things out of the laboratory with its very strict and limited it's a very strict and well-defined environment, and you take these programs outdoors, so to speak, you immediately run into the problem that they have to do an infinite and exponentially growing number of calculations, right, to deal with that environment, and that was not possible. So the 80s, we use a lot of AI, so to speak, in narrowly defined settings, and in concrete practical applications. Language translation remained a hot button issue. Traffic control, the beginning of biomedical information processing. So that was mostly, for example, recognizing tumors, for example, in a scan, right? We have the beginnings of neurocomputing. So there was this growing association between AI and what's going on in our human brains. And also always an ongoing hot button issue or important issue was pattern recognition, like quality control, for example, in industrial production processes, right? So those were more the civilian things, right? In the military sphere, it was a lot about, for example, like missile guidance or, again, language translation in the military context, satellite imagery, the analysis of satellite imagery, and also expert systems. So those were AI systems that could help people make decisions, right? So you would feed, so to speak, expert knowledge into the computer, and then they could basically, depending on the problem they were asked to solve, they could provide solutions. Okay, the 90s really are the turning point here because of not only growing computing power, but also because the exponentially growing amount of data that was available. And in this case, we speak of digital data. And obviously with the beginning of the internet, which itself, of course, is a result of the Cold War arms race, we simply humanity started accumulating insane amounts of data. And that data could be used to train the algorithms. Okay? So I don't want to bore you too much with the technical side of this, but just keep in mind that from the 90s on, there was more and more and more data available, right? Simply also because people were on the internet, right? So they generated data. So that really were sort of the two drivers, right? Ever improving computer technology and ever growing amounts of digital data. Okay, now with regard to which geopolitical factors drove the growing investments in AI, there's always sort of especially starting in the 90s, private corporations sort of start taking over, right? Most of the development. And that was in reaction to growing demand from governments for all kinds of solutions that required, to some extent, AI solutions. There was 9/11 and the war on terror, right? Where we tried to basically collect data on the internet about potential terrorist activities, right? There was this whole idea and the changing sort of ways of fighting wars, right? The digitization, right? Cyber war and cyber espionage. Again, all reactions to the growing importance of the internet and digital information and communication. And then in the 2000s, you start seeing sort of the emergence of robots and semi-autonomous weapon systems, so drones, for example, right? And a lot of that was, of course, developed in reaction to governments around the world looking for solutions, right, to these challenges. So that's one thing. The companies, the private corporations, increasingly, of course, are or have always been profit-oriented. They operate in an extremely competitive global high-tech sectors. And those sectors are often marked by what we call oligopolies. So in other words, it's not an oligopoly, which would be one company, but you have basically a handful of companies, depending on what you look at. You have around a dozen companies around the world that really dominate what has become known as digital capitalism, right? So that's your Facebook, your Google, Microsoft, Apple. There are some companies in China, Alibaba, and so on, right? So they are in very tight competition with each other, but none of them really dominate or are able to create a monopoly. So, and those are the major drivers of AI these days, because they also account for most of the research and development, right? They pour a tremendous amount of money into research and development, and have sort of over time, so to speak, crowded out government-funded research and development. And I just want to show you that briefly. So here you see basically over the last 70 years, basically, how this has developed. You have in blue, and that's for the US, by the way. You have research and development expenditures as a percentage of GDP. And then in yellow, you would have federally funded research and development. In red, you have corporate R&D. And then at the bottom in green, you have, your foundations or something, right? Or any other form of R&D funds. And what you see here clearly is that the government over time has not completely abandoned research and development, but it kind of pales a little bit in comparison to corporate research and development. Right? So these companies really are dominating that part of technological evolution. Now, how much are companies pouring in? On the left side, you see sort of corporate R&D spending. I mean, those are significant amounts, right? With 2021 so far representing, so to speak, the top, the strongest year, almost $280 billion in AI. And that could be not just investment in R&D, but also acquiring other companies, right? Smaller companies, startups. On the right side, you see sort of a comparison in terms of countries and the number of startups, AI-related startups. So you clearly see that the United States is outpacing everyone else pretty clearly. Right. So that gives you an idea of, so to speak, who it's almost like a ranking, right? And yeah, so the US clearly dominates the AI sector in terms of startups and in terms of spending with regard to AI. And then here we see now. So now we move on from the corporate world, so to speak, to the country level. That's sort of one way to rank. We have to rank countries somehow. So you often get in the research, you find these what we call composite indicators or composite rankings, where we take a lot of different dimensions that are important for technological evolution. In this case, AI. And try to rank countries in each of those dimensions. And then at the end, you sort of get a composite indicator, and that allows you to rank the country overall. And so obviously the US comes out on top, particularly when it comes to talent, infrastructure, research and development, right? So you see it's a very fine-grained ranking here. Some countries do great on R&D, right? They're not so good when it comes to the infrastructure, or they are not so good in terms of a government strategy, a clearly formulated government strategy, right? So, but those are the 12 top-ranked countries according to the Global AI Index. So that does give you a little bit of an idea, sort of a who's who, right, of global AI. Yeah, and the rankings will not be that different with regard to then the military AI capabilities, right? Of course, nobody really, no country sort of posts, what they're spending on their military AI capabilities, but we have to use something like that ranking as a proxy, right, to get an idea of how strong countries might be with regard to the military side of this. I don't like the term arms race, right? Because AI is so widely used, not just in the military, but also sort of in the civilian sphere, that the term arms race to me always, it doesn't really quite capture the foundational importance of AI. Okay, I thought this might also be interesting to look a little bit at public perceptions regarding AI. So this is from a 2023, it's also from the AI index report, the chart, but it looks at sort of how people in a variety of countries think about the benefits and sort of the negative side effects of AI. And you see basically here that the countries in which people are sort of the most optimistic, right, or see mostly advantages with regard to AI. That was the question, right? Products and services using AI have more benefits than drawbacks. So China, Saudi Arabia, India, and so on are here in the top. And then at the bottom, we have countries like France, Canada, the Netherlands, and interestingly, also the United States, right? Or not quite as convinced about the positive impact of AI. Now we could speculate, you and I could speculate afterwards why that is, right? But I thought it's just interesting to see how different the respondents think about this in a variety of countries. All right, so now about the challenges. Well, so to make a long story short, especially from a US perception, maybe also from a European perception, it is, of course, China, right? China is sort of the big challenge. And that for economic reasons, for military reasons, and ultimately, I think also for social/identity reasons, right? I mean, the China represents a very particular approach to AI. The way the Chinese government uses AI within its own borders is, I think, to many people in the West, and rightfully so, quite scary. So there is a lot of that going on, but obviously this also has really sort of global implications. Now, why is China so heavily invested in that? Well, it's part of a larger strategy to sort of upgrade the Chinese economy, right? I mean, for the last 30 years, China has developed into the workbench of the global economy. About 20 years ago, China decided that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, decided that it was also necessary to sort of incrementally upgrade the Chinese economy. So I always say they wanted to move away from just making matchbox cars, right? And cheap sort of plastic products to making more sophisticated products, like high-tech products. So they did this over a long period of time, very strategically. military investments in AI, but particularly a lot of investments in the they described what has become known as new type infrastructure, NTI. So 5G, mobile communication networks, digital currencies, satellite internet, data centers, and the industrial internet. And then, so that's a lot of that is basically domestically within China. But then they've also really developed this sort of external strategy, which became known as the Digital Silk Road. In other words, China has made a lot of investments in other countries, a lot of them sort of poorer or newly developing countries. A lot of it happens within the region, right, Southeast Asia, but also a lot has happened in Africa. So they will build digital communication, mobile communication network, for example. They will build internet, right? They will, yeah, so all kinds, that type of investments, right? And of course, it's all provided by Chinese companies, right, such as Huawei. So that, of course, has raised concerns in the West, not just in the US, but increasingly also in Europe, because the Chinese have also over the last 15, 20 years started making foreign investments in the sense that they would buy up companies abroad and thereby acquire the know-how, right, from these companies, which they could then sort of use to strengthen their own industrial and military base. So the US in the last couple of years has pivoted with a much stronger focus on these high-tech sectors, right? And try to limit China's sort of rise in those areas. So many of you might be aware of this, right? We're trying to restrict access to high-performance computer chips and other technology that is sort of required to develop AI capabilities. We, for the last couple of years, have tried to onshore, like bring back manufacturing capacity to the US, particularly the Chips and Science Act passed by the Biden administration is trying to do that, right? So provides basically public funding for chip manufacturers, among others, to basically establish new manufacturing capacities in the US. One of these manufacturing plants is being constructed as we speak outside of Columbus. That's not the only one. We are simultaneously trying to prevent China from acquiring, for example, production technology, right? For computer chips. So there is since I think in 2022 or even just last year, the Biden administration basically formed a strategic alliance with Japan and particularly the Netherlands to prevent China from basically buying the most advanced chip production technology. And that's, of course, with the goal of slowing down their development. Right? We have started, countries around the world, particularly in the West, have stopped or basically excluded Chinese companies from bidding for public infrastructure networks, infrastructure projects, excuse me, particularly G5 mobile communication networks, and that again, particularly with a focus on Huawei. So several countries also in Europe have basically backroad and said, no, we will exclude we will exclude Chinese companies from bidding in these public tenders. And then, of course, the US also tries to match or somehow figure out how to restrict Chinese foreign investments in those target areas of Southeast Asia and Africa. What are the main challenges? Well, there is sort of potential, I see potential clashes between government priorities, geostrategic priorities by the US government, and and the priorities of corporations, right? Corporations often spread technology, try to give away technology, certain learning programs or language programs, right? Certain algorithms with the goal of turning those algorithms into global standards. That means that potentially anybody around the world can use those language models, learning models, to build their own AI. So there's sort of a clash of priorities. There is, of course, at this point, I mean, we are in an election season. There are questions about, well, will we maintain that focus? Will the next administration the control? And then in the military field, there's a lot of concern in the academic community about the implications of ever more autonomously acting weapons systems. So there is definitely an arms race going on. And at this point, I don't see, based on my readings, I don't see a consensus or a willingness to engage in serious debates at the global level to limit autonomous weapon systems. So in other words, there is not a lot of willingness towards to consider arms control agreements. So if nobody does anything and at the same time everybody tries to further develop, then there is some concern or some serious concern actually that we will see a threshold, a lower threshold for armed conflict with those weapon systems. And then lastly, sort of from where I stand, it's just a global diffusion of AI capabilities, right? I mean, AI capabilities are like any digital technology can easily diffuse, right? It's very hard to contain these technologies, right? I always joke and say, you know, when we talk about cyber war, all it takes is a bored teenager in Russia with a rather good laptop, you know, and some serious programming skills, and they can wreak havoc on critical national infrastructure, right? So that's generally, these digital technologies are sort of leveling to some extent the playing field, right? Also for non-state actors such as terrorists or criminals. So that's just a much broader concern when it comes to these technologies. And yeah, I think I'll stop at that point because I've already talked way too long. Okay, okay. No problem. I will have to close the shade here because now the light is coming in. And it's still not.
There we go. Okay.
Try that.
Thank you, Stefan. For questions? Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Hi, I have a question regarding the federal spending at the moment. Since there's such a big disparity between the U.S. government funding AI research, corporations funding it, obviously their goals are completely different. Corporations will use this as a way to enhance profitability for shareholders. Do you see any narrowing of that so that if the government spending were to be more, it would have a more prolific effect, a very good effect for people in the U.S. as opposed to a very narrow shareholder effect? Okay, he's frozen again. Oh, God.
Sorry. Yeah, now I can hear you again. I think I didn't catch the last part of the question.
I think the general question is, do you foresee in any of your readings or research that the government spending will get closer to approaching corporate spending on AI research?
Okay. No, to be honest. And that has mostly to do, which doesn't necessarily mean that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of practical outcome, right? It's more a question of philosophy, right? And that's sort of the pulling out of the federal government from sort of funding research and development was sort of if I had to pinpoint that in history, I would say, well, the 80s, right? It sort of is a long-term effect of, I mean, you saw that graph, right? So, I mean, it's been a long-term effect, right? But I think it was particularly since the Reagan years in the 80s where the general sort of ideology was more sort of government should get out of a lot of these things, right? Small government and whatnot, and instead bring in sort of privately funded R&D. So, and companies obviously react to, I mean, still react to the wish list, the governmental wish list, right? I mean, a lot of the research and development that is done at these large companies like Google, right, particularly Facebook or other companies like Palantir, for example, they of course closely collaborate with the NSA and other governmental agencies. So, and obviously they receive money, right, for providing these services. So it's kind of like a philosophical debate, right? If you think that, well, it's the government's role to engage in this, or you say, well, but corporations are simply more efficient, and at this point they have the know-how and the technical capabilities to actually maybe more effectively and quicker develop these new products that the government relies on. So plus I haven't provided the data, but you look at for example, it's actually becoming a problem for academia, for universities, right? Because if you're freshly minted, let's say computer engineer or software programmer or some AI researcher, you look at the paycheck that is offered by a university versus what is offered by Google. I think it's a pretty clear decision, right? Unless you really just want to go into academia, right? But these companies suck up a lot of talent, globally speaking, right? So it's in other words, it becomes very difficult for the federal government also to compete in terms of salaries and working conditions, right? Overall attractiveness. And that's particularly for the US, right? In Europe, it might still be a little different, right? But sorry, this is a lengthy answer, but I don't see that gap sort of closing anytime soon, because that would require a massive reorientation and a massive reallocation of funds from the government.
You've mentioned China several times, but there's not been much of a reference to Russia. What is Russia's contribution to AI?
Well, Russia The Russian contribution has been mostly in what we call disinformation and what has become known in the last 10, 15 years of so-called hybrid warfare, right? So that's a lengthy. Sorry, I'll just try to figure out a short answer. So since probably the 2016 elections, there has been growing concern about Russia's abilities to sort of engage. I mean, it's still good old propaganda, right, and disinformation, but increasingly this is executed in the digital sphere, right? So it's social networks, it's with bots and trolls, troll factories that just produce a lot of fake information, fake news, and that way try to subvert, for example, electoral processes in the West, right? There was just a story a couple of days ago that in France there are really big fears now that Russia might try and sort of digitally sabotage the Olympics that are starting very soon. So I don't see Russia's contribution from everything I've read as constructive in any way, right? If then it's disruptive and obviously primarily serves its goals of undermining, democratic decision-making processes, particularly in Western countries. And that has just accelerated and expanded since basically since 2014 already, since they occupied the Crimean Peninsula. So that's my take on that. It's not a good contribution, that's for sure.
Question is the proposed ban on TikTok part of the U.S.'s effort to slow the advancement of AI by China?
So how is that connected to the TikTok ban? Is that?
I'm sorry, what do you say? Yeah, is the TikTok proposed ban part of our effort to slow the progress of AI by China?
Yes, I think it's partly the main problem here with TikTok was that, or is that, and that's sort of that's a bigger issue with regard to how the Communist Party sort of relates to private sort of corporations in China, right? I mean, we are really unsure because these are such murky relationships, right? That the fear here is that the user data, there are two related issues. One is that the Chinese government could, through these companies, gain access to the user data of anybody who uses TikTok in the West. The other one is that these companies could be forced, or the Chinese government could twist their arms to support them in disinformation campaigns, right? In sort of trying and shape public perceptions abroad, right? When it comes to all kinds of issues, right? How the Uyghurs are treated in Xinjiang, or the information monopoly of the Communist Party, and so on and so on and so on, right? So I think there are some real concerns. Plus, and we haven't even talked about the addictive qualities of all of these platforms, right? Which is a whole other issue area, right? So that is definitely an effort, right, or falls within that US strategy, right, to sort of rein in China's digital footprint. The problem is we're clashing here with the users. citizens slash users in the US. So, I,
Okay. You kind of faded out there for a moment. Stefan?
yep.
Alrighty. One and two.
So I asked this question earlier in the week, and the presenter gave us an answer and then suggested that I ask other presenters this week. But my news feed popped up the idea that there might be an AI bubble coming along, and that there was a limit to how much corporations were going to continue to invest in this without a significant ROI. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. You had one graph in particular that showed the investment going up from a corporate standpoint pretty dramatically. How long can that be sustained?
I have come across these assessments about a bubble, which would not be that surprising if you think back to the internet, the new economy bubble, right? In what was it, 1999, 2000, right? That popped. So that's another, just as a reminder, right, that this wouldn't be the first time that we see a tech-related bubble, investment bubble, ultimately pop, because there's just all this money flowing in, right, hoping for tremendous returns on investment, and also sort of, again, a sort of an overconfidence or overpromising of what will be possible with AI. I'm pretty sympathetic to this assessment because I spent this summer, or actually all spring, but I've kept reading over the summer sort of books written by AI people, right? I mean, the scientists and engineers that really work on this. And even within the science/engineering community, there are widely differing opinions on when we will have a sort of a singularity, right? Or when AI will become, sort of self-conscious, or will have the ability to learn on its. I mean, they're already learning on the algorithms can learn on their own, but there's a lot of discussion within the community as to, aren't we sort of over-optimistic, right? I mean, these first researchers in the 1950s at Dartmouth thought that they might have self-driving cars within 15 years, right? So I think we are, again, you might be right that we see sort of the slowdown here as a reaction to this sort of realization that we might still be further away from these sort of super radical innovative steps than we think we are, right? I mean, in other words, there's a discrepancy between what the experts that actually deal with AI and try to develop this think is possible, and sort of the timeline versus what the public perception is, right? So, and I have no final answer to that, because depending on who you read, right, it could be 15 years away, the singularity, or it could be another 50 years away. And some people say it might never be possible actually for AI to truly develop a sort of consciousness, right? And that brings us far into sort of the neurological, the research, right, of how we think, how we process information, how we make decisions, and ultimately, now we're getting almost philosophical here, what consciousness actually is, right? Because despite all the the neurobiological research that's going on with regard to our brain, nobody has any answer to the question of what consciousness, like how we actually generate consciousness, like how do we as human beings become conscious? That is still that's the big mystery, right? And some people say, some experts say, maybe we shouldn't even aim for that, right? I mean, we can do a lot of good thing with, so to speak, dumber AI, right? The problem that we have nowadays, right now, is that there's a lot of dumb AI out there that makes bad decisions and shouldn't be deployed at that point, right? So we can achieve a lot with not quite as sophisticated AI, right? We don't necessarily have to shoot for, the equivalent of the human brain.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up on that. Back in 1970, The Ohio State University, I took a class on applied innovation. And I expect you know, but back then they thought within 10 years it would be ubiquitous. Well, here we are today thinking the same thing, right?
Yeah. But then came the hard reality, right? Of, a couple reports came out, one in Great Britain in particular, and one in the US that sort of shut this down because they said, we're not there, we're not even close. But, if you look at the long term, I mean, this is one of the fascinating things that drives innovation, right? It's always these expectations of what might be possible, right? I think this is one of the big drivers, right? This sort of enthusiasm, and then halfway through you realize, oh, that's going to take much longer, right? That's a recurring theme in sort of the history of technology.
My question is about I'm kind of fascinated that it's the large corporations that are really driving the development of AI. And I'm wondering about regulations about data that gets put into the systems, and any regulation of the algorithms that we use on a day-to-day basis.
Well, working on this from an EU perspective, I can tell you that although the EU just 2 months ago passed the AI Act, which is the first effort to comprehensively regulate AI, nobody knows at this point how this is going to be implemented on the ground. That's the big question, right? Because the EU will in the future expect, particularly they have these different categories, risk categories for AI, and nobody knows at this point how the researchers, the engineers, the scientists are supposed to document, so to speak, the capabilities of, like, what goes into the training of the algorithm, right? The data, and to document how the algorithm actually gets to its final results, right? I mean, fundamentally, these most sophisticated algorithms today, these self-learning algorithms, or even ChatGPT, the people who designed this can't tell you what's going on, right? It's a black box. It's a classic example of what in science and technology studies is called a black box. Right, even the biggest AI experts. I remember there was a CBS interview about, when was it, like a 60-minute episode about, when was this? Within the last year, maybe within the last 6 months, and they interviewed basically one of the founding fathers of modern AI, who works at the University of Toronto. He's originally from Scotland, started out in Edinburgh, which is another big AI center since the 60s. And he basically said, we have no idea what's happening, right? We cannot explain how these algorithms come to their conclusions, right? And so again, it's a classic example for a black box. So as long as you don't know what's happening in the black box, how are you going to regulate the black box, right? this is probably for me, from my point of view, that biggest challenge, right? If you try to regulate that. And it's actually, I could maybe tell you more in about a year when I've done interviews with AI scientists, with AI programmers, right, in startups. How do you think they're going to implement this, right? Do you need 50 lawyers, or do you have to think about this before you even start designing or your algorithm, right? How are you gonna do this? It's completely, it's a mystery, right?
Just your thoughts on, even if you know what's going on in the black box, with companies being the predominant versus the federal government users of this, and they want to protect that information, even if they know what is in it. And then countries want to protect information from each other so that they don't gain advantage. How do you learn? Like, how do we advance if everybody's protecting their own information and we can't go forward because we're not working together, to try to make the field go faster? I don't understand, it's a political answer, I know, but I just find that's interesting that we could go faster, but nobody wants to tell other people that would compete with them, either countries or companies, what their secrets are. Even
Right.
if we eventually do figure out what's in the black box. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that and how that slows progress.
Well, you could also make the counter argument, and just for the sake of the argument, okay, that you say, well, should we even regulate that? That's bad. Any regulation could be bad for innovation, right? The scientists, engineers often say, well, I'm just developing this stuff, and it's actually interesting, the AI Act only deals with stuff like algorithms, regulates algorithms that are sort of released into the market, right? In a lab setting, you can still do whatever you want, right? There's no limitations on what you can do, even high risk AI, right? You could be working on the next or even more sophisticated social scoring AI, right? Which is our sort of nightmare scenario in the West, because that's what China has already implemented in China, right? Where based on all kinds of personal information and data, right? Down to public security cameras, tracking every move, like looking at, do you stop at the red light at the zebra crossing? Do you walk across? What's your credit history? Who are you hanging out with? Who are your contacts on social networks? What are you commenting on? Are you criticizing the government? And then based on that, you get a social credit score. And if it falls below a certain amount, you are blocked from using the bus, buying plane tickets, using the train, moving from that to that city, or, being excluded from job applications, right? So you could develop that even in Europe in a lab setting, right? There's no limitation when it comes to that. For scientific purposes, so to speak, you could do that in Europe still under the AI Act. The problem just starts then when you say, oh, now I'm going to release this into the market, right? So what it comes down to me personally, for me, it's a matter of trust, right? I mean, we are in this sort of arms race now, and everybody's trying to get ahead or stay ahead in the game. And at the same time, as you said, there is very limited or no willingness to share or just sit down and just discuss this openly, because it's kind of like a rat race, right? You just try to gain the advantage, stay on top of things, gain the upper hand. The corporations obviously want to maintain this central role because it's their proprietary knowledge and technology, and they want to use it to generate money, right? So it's gonna be, those are gonna be interesting years ahead, you know, where we're trying to figure out if how we can regulate that. So, and as you said correctly, the government obviously is governments. It's not just the US, it's around the world are always 5 steps behind, right? In trying to you know, you try to regulate something, but the companies are already, you know, 2 steps ahead, or try to figure out a way already to circumvent the regulation. Just another case from Europe, because we are really sort of, we're having a lot of like fist fights these days with, like regulatorily speaking, with the US corporations like Apple, Microsoft, right, Google. I mean, they get fined left and right in Europe, billions of dollars, but they pay this out of their like you know, that's peanuts for them, right? If you look at their capitalization. But we tried to, for example, just recently, the EU tried to break up or tried to open up the App Store, right? Apple's App Store, so that other apps could sort of move in there, and they tried to sort of break up Apple's iron grip on sort of the financial remuneration that Apple gets from allowing apps to sort of make it into the App Store. And the European Union said you have to change sort of that model, that financial model. You have to make it more accessible. You have to basically open this up and provide alternative ways of, you know, financing or paying for it. And then what did Apple do? They said, okay, they did the bare minimum. They basically they pro forma opened it up. But the new model they came up with was at the end of the day really not that much different. It still generated most of the revenue for Apple, right, and not for the actual app developers. It was just differently structured. And of course, there were all kinds of negative side effects came with that. That, let's say, if a European then travels abroad for a certain time period, I can't remember what it was, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they wouldn't get any updates for those alternative apps, right? Apps that were sort of paid for differently. And so this was just one of these examples where you try to regulate and impose, and then the minute you try to do that, they already have a solution to get around that, right? And at the end of the day, the question is, well, the user is just at the losing end of this, right? Because the functionality goes down with that. And what I always wonder is, does the user actually care at the end of the day, right? Maybe 95% of all App Store users are just perfectly fine with the way things are, you know?
All right, well, thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are no further questions, have a great day at the Lakeside. And maybe we'll meet once in the future at some point in person. Maybe I'll finally make my way there. Thank you.